Welcome to Birth Words. This is episode number 49. Today we're going to revisit the topic of silence.
Welcome to Birth Words. Words are powerful. What are you doing with yours? In this podcast, birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sarah Pixton invites you to be intentional, reflective, and empowering with your language as we come together to honor those who give birth. The work of Birth Words is to elevate the language surrounding pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. Nothing in this podcast should be taken as medical advice.
Hello again. Welcome to Birth Words this week. As I was considering what to talk about this week, I was reminded of some comments that happened on social media accounts following the previous episode about silence and wanted to follow up on that. In episode number 47, we talked about silence and the role that silence can play as an act of communication beyond language, a way to say, wow, what's happening here is beyond the power of words to communicate. And I agree still with myself that that is a powerful role of silence, that's something that can happen in the birth space when words are inappropriate because the birth giver is turned inside, outside stimulus is distracting, and doesn't honor the process of giving birth, and that silence can honor that process sometimes more than any words could. However, we had an interesting discussion in some of the social media groups around birth words about silence. There were a wide variety of opinions from birth givers themselves about their preference for silence or communication, even during the most intense parts of labor. Some birth givers said, I need it to be silent. I'm so inside myself that any outside talking distraction will be just that. It'll be a distraction and I won't be able to focus on the work that my body is doing. And others said, wow, I was so grateful for the support of those in my birth space that communicated verbally with me throughout each contraction. They were right there talking me through it, giving me tips and giving me encouragement. And so this really, again, is unique to each individual, the way that silence communicates with them. Another thing that came up was, what does it mean when the birth giver is silent? One doula suggested that she questions when her clients are silent, whether that's indicative of past trauma, and they're going to that place of silence is a signal of that. And she said, whether or not that's the case, I, in those cases, tend to be extra aware of following their lead and responding to their cues. And that silence is an indication that perhaps more attention is needed. Silence on the part of the birth giver perhaps invites or indicates to the support team that more intentional support is needed, that maybe there's something specific going on here that they really need to tune in to the needs of the birth giver and really follow that lead. Another thing that came up in these conversations was that silence throughout pregnancy, early labor, those sorts of things can be absolutely inappropriate if it means that critical conversations aren't happening. So we've talked in previous episodes about informed consent and about informed decision making more especially, and how to have those two things happen, to have informed choices being made. Discussion, communication is absolutely necessary. And if silence is happening when those conversations should be happening, that's inappropriate. So if an episiotomy is cut without consent, and that is something done in silence, that silence is absolutely inappropriate. Or if other things are done to the birth giver without a conversation that involves both parties, or however many parties are involved, speaking, asking questions, and understanding the choice that's being presented, any alternatives, and consulting the birth giver's intuition and giving time to truly make a decision. That is something that needs to happen for informed choice to happen. So certainly silence is not always appropriate. Another thing that can happen with silence, we've talked before about speech act theory. This is J.L. Austin's theory that when we speak, we actually change the way things are. We perform, we do things with our words. And I think that it's also true that we do things with our silence. And sometimes that's not intentional. But sometimes silence means that we're complicit to something that's happening that we're not commenting on. Sometimes in the birth space, there are instances where birth givers are mistreated. And silence in that space can be damaging because it plays the performative role of accepting what's going on. It has been a hard week here in the U.S. We began the week finding out about the death of George Floyd under police custody in Minneapolis. And the officer involved has been charged with third-degree murder. Many voices are saying a variety of things. I myself was tempted at first to succumb to silence because mostly of a feeling of overwhelm, of a feeling of helplessness and confusion and just being distraught that acts of violence at the hands of officials that are supposed to be people of trust continue to happen to people of color in our country. But I knew that there were people waiting, looking to see, people of color, my friends and colleagues, waiting to see who's tuned in to this gash at our community, who's tuned in. Maternal mortality rates for Black women in the U.S. are significantly higher than they are for white women or other races. Racism is not a thing of the past. It's not something that we dealt with in the 60s and 70s and have now moved beyond. It is systemic. It is widespread. It is often implicit, not really spoken until it comes out in certain moments. I am choosing to use my voice to speak out against injustice. I am choosing to use my platform to invite others to be introspective and consider what resources they have to become more aware of the issues of racism that persist in our country and what they can do to be more aware of them. This is something that affects the birth experience for many families in our world. And in the U.S. specifically, as I stated, that the maternal mortality rate for Black women is higher in some parts of the country, in some parts of Mississippi, than it is in sub-Saharan Africa, where there is far less medical care. We need to choose to use our voices and to not fall into silence, to find active ways to advocate for those who are oppressed, and to rise above and beyond silence in the instances where silence is inappropriate. I thank you for joining me this week. I send my love to you and pray for a more peaceful world that we can each work to build.
If you're interested in sharing your ideas or experiences on the podcast, go to birthwords.com. If you're liking what you hear, please leave a review on your podcast app. For more resources about language for a better birth, subscribe to the monthly newsletter at birthwords.com and follow Birthwords on Instagram and Facebook.